There is something that happens every night in millions of homes across the English-speaking world that would have seemed very strange to people living a generation ago. People lie down in their beds, in the dark, put on headphones, or leave a tablet on the nightstand and listen to detailed accounts of murders, of disappearances, of bodies found in fields and basements and cars. They listen to these accounts, and many of them fall asleep to them. In the morning, they wake up and listen to more. The True Crime Podcast is currently the most downloaded audio format in the world. The True Crime documentary is among the most watched content on every major streaming platform. Something is happening here that deserves a close and honest look. Not a horrified look, not a judgmental one, but an honest examination of what this enormous collective appetite tells us about who we are right now, in this particular moment, and what we are looking for when we settle in for another episode about another case that haunted another community, in another year that is somehow never quite far enough away. Tonight, we are going to take that look. We are going to trace how true crime went from a niche literary form read by a small devoted audience to the dominant genre of popular entertainment, and what that journey tells us about the culture that produced it. We will spend time with the writers and journalists and filmmakers who built the genre, with the cases that defined it, and with the question that sits at the center of everything. Why do we watch? And what does our watching mean? And what obligations does it carry? But first, get comfortable. Let your body settle. Let the day release its grip on you. Whatever you are carrying from today, you can set it down for a while. It will still be there when you need it. Tonight, for a little while, you don't have to solve anything. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, calm, unhurried, something worth listening to, a like or a subscription means more than you might think to a small channel like this one. It's how these stories reach the people who need them. Now let everything else go. We are starting in the middle of the 20th century, with a quiet man in Kansas and a book that changed what was possible in American nonfiction. The history of true crime as a popular genre begins, in most serious accounts, with Truman Capote and a book called In Cold Blood, published in 1966. Capote reads a small newspaper article about the murder of a farm family in Holcomb, Kansas, the Clutter family, a father and mother and two of their children, killed in their home on a November night in 1959, for reasons that were not immediately clear. He travels to Kansas with his childhood friend Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, who helps him gain the trust of a community that is deeply shaken and suspicious of outsiders. He spends 6 years reporting the story. He interviews the killers, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, in prison over many months. He attends their execution, and he produces something that does not quite exist yet, a book that has the emotional and narrative depth of a novel, but claims to be the factual account of real events, real people, real deaths, told with the full array of fictional techniques applied to non-fictional material. Capote called it a non-fiction novel. Critics called it the birth of new journalism. What it actually was, in retrospect, was the first major work of popular culture to treat a true crime story with the full weight and seriousness that had previously been reserved for fiction. The killers, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, were rendered not as monsters, but as human beings, damaged, comprehensible, produced by circumstances that the reader could understand even while condemning the acts those circumstances had contributed to. Smith in particular is drawn with a sympathy that some readers have always found disturbing, a man of genuine intelligence and artistic sensitivity, capable of real warmth, capable also of this. The victims were given faces and personalities and histories. The community was explored with genuine curiosity and care. The legal process, the investigation, the trial, the appeals, the years on death row, was followed in detail that gave readers an unprecedented window into how the American criminal justice system actually worked, as opposed to how it was supposed to work. In Cold Blood sold millions of copies and was adapted for film almost immediately. It demonstrated, commercially and critically, that there was an enormous appetite for true crime material presented with literary ambition, for stories about real violence that neither sanitized the horror nor wallowed in it, that tried instead to understand how something like this could happen and what it meant that it had. The book established a template that writers and later filmmakers and podcasters would follow for decades. The immersive single-case investigation, told from multiple perspectives, using novelistic technique to render real events with emotional and psychological depth. Capote himself was somewhat destroyed by the experience. He became deeply entangled with the killers, particularly Perry Smith, in ways that complicated his objectivity and contributed to a long creative decline from which he never fully recovered. He attended the executions of both men and was profoundly affected by them. He spoke of the book as having cost him something irreplaceable. But the work he produced outlasted all of that, and in cold blood remains in print and continues to find new readers more than 50 years after its publication, because it asked questions about crime and punishment and human nature that have not become less urgent with time. The decades that followed produced a rich tradition of true crime writing that built on Capote's foundation. Ann Rule, who had worked alongside Ted Bundy at a crisis hotline before his crimes became known to her, wrote The Stranger Beside Me in 1980, a book that introduced millions of readers to the specific horror of retrospective recognition, the experience of discovering that the charming, helpful man you knew was capable of things you could not have imagined. Rule's book was unique in the genre for the intimacy it required. She was writing about someone she had liked, someone who had been kind to her, someone she had believed. The book's power came from that intimacy, from the way it made vivid how thoroughly a violent person can hide within the texture of ordinary social life. Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, about the Manson murders, sold millions and demonstrated that true crime about famous cases could reach an audience far beyond the dedicated readers who had previously defined the genre. Joe McGinnis's Fatal Vision, about Jeffrey MacDonald, sparked the first major ethical debate about how true crime writers should conduct themselves with their subjects. MacDonald had cooperated extensively with McGinnis and was then the subject of a book that argued for his guilt. The writer Janet Malcolm used this case as the basis for The Journalist and the Murderer, one of the sharpest examinations of the ethics of literary journalism ever written. These books and the conversations they generated established the intellectual infrastructure of a genre that was still, in the 1980s, considered slightly disreputable, popular but not serious, consumed widely but not openly discussed the way that literary fiction or serious history was. The people who read true crime in this period often read it in a particular way, in private, with a faint awareness that their interest might be considered morbid or inappropriate by people who didn't share it. True crime occupied an ambiguous cultural space, and the people who loved it often had difficulty explaining why, even to themselves. This ambiguity was itself, in a way, part of the appeal. There was a charge to consuming something that felt slightly transgressive, that sat just outside the zone of what polite culture fully endorsed. This would change dramatically and definitively in 2014. The transformation of true crime from a niche literary genre into a mainstream cultural phenomenon has a relatively precise starting point, October 3rd, 2014, when a podcast called Serial launched its first episode. It was produced by Sarah Koenig, a journalist at This American Life, who had become interested in the 1999 murder of a Baltimore high school student named Heyman Lee and the conviction of her former boyfriend, Adnan Syed, for the crime. Syed had maintained his innocence throughout his trial and in the years since his conviction. Koenig had been introduced to the case by a mutual acquaintance and had spent a year investigating it before beginning to record. Serial did something that had not quite been done before in the podcast format. It applied the standards and methods of serious investigative journalism to a true crime case and released the investigation in real time, in weekly episodes, as the investigation was still ongoing and its conclusion still genuinely uncertain. Koenig did not know, when she began, what she would find. She did not know how the story would end, or whether it would end at all in any satisfying sense. She was genuinely uncertain about Adnan Syed's guilt, uncertain in ways she communicated openly. And this uncertainty was not a rhetorical device or a narrative technique designed to create suspense. It was her actual epistemic state, honestly reported. The response was extraordinary. Serial became the fastest podcast to reach 5 million downloads in iTunes history. It was discussed in offices and on social media and in mainstream publications that had not previously paid much attention to podcasts. It generated a Reddit community devoted to analyzing the case. It prompted legal reviews of Adnan Syed's conviction. It sparked a national conversation about the criminal justice system, about the reliability of memory and witness testimony, about what reasonable doubt actually means, and whether the legal standard for it is adequate to the complexity of real cases. It made a generation of people into sophisticated critics of criminal procedure who could talk fluently about alibi evidence and cell tower data, and the specific ways that confessions can be coerced. But most importantly for understanding what happened next, it demonstrated that the true crime story, told with journalistic rigor, with genuine respect for the complexity of what was being examined, could reach an enormous and deeply engaged mainstream audience that had no previous investment in the genre. Serial was not consumed as escapism by the millions of people who listened to it. It was consumed as the serious engagement with a real and unresolved human situation that Koenig had intended it to be. Listeners felt genuinely invested, felt that the fate of Adnan Syed was not merely a narrative question but a question of actual moral consequence for which they, having spent hours with the evidence, now had some responsibility. The industry that followed in Serial's wake was not always as rigorous. The success of the format demonstrated enormous commercial appetite, and enormous commercial appetite produces content that serves that appetite rather than the more demanding standards that had made the original compelling. True crime podcasts multiplied exponentially. Some were excellent. Many were adequate. Some were, by any honest assessment, exploitative, treating the suffering of real victims primarily as narrative raw material, with the families and communities affected given little consideration beyond their utility to the story. The hosts of these podcasts were sometimes people with no journalistic training and no ethical framework for engaging with the material they were presenting. The content they produced reached millions of people. The people at the center of the stories they told rarely had any meaningful input into how those stories were framed. The parallel development on streaming platforms followed a similar arc. Netflix's Making a Murderer, released in December 2015, did for documentary true crime what Serial had done for the podcast format. The 10-episode series followed Stephen Avery, a Wisconsin man who had been wrongfully convicted of sexual assault, served 18 years in prison, been exonerated by DNA evidence, and then been charged with murder shortly after filing a civil lawsuit against the county that had imprisoned him. The series was consumed in ways that presaged the binge-watching culture Netflix would go on to define. People watched all 10 hours in single weekends and emerged, convinced they had witnessed a profound injustice, that the legal system had failed deliberately, that Avery and his nephew, Brendan Dassey, had been railroaded by a corrupt county apparatus. Making a Murderer arrived at a moment when public trust in institutions was under significant stress. The Black Lives Matter movement was bringing sustained attention to the systematic ways in which the criminal justice system operated differently for different communities. The exoneration movement, powered by DNA evidence and organizations like the Innocence Project, was revealing that wrongful convictions were far more common than anyone had previously acknowledged. True crime documentaries gave millions of people an emotionally immediate way of engaging with these systemic issues. Watching Making a Murderer, you were not engaging with abstract statistics about wrongful conviction rates. You were watching a specific person, in a specific place, being processed by a specific system that appeared to operate according to interests other than justice. The emotional engagement the form produced, the anger, the outrage, the feeling of having witnessed something that demanded a response was real and legitimate, even when the documentaries producing it were presenting partial or contested accounts of the cases they covered. Making a Murderer was criticized by legal scholars and journalists who examined its claims carefully for omitting evidence that complicated its implicit argument about Avery's innocence. These criticisms were largely drowned out by the wave of popular response. The audience had been given a story, and they had experienced it emotionally, and the emotional experience was more powerful than the subsequent analytical corrections. Jeffrey Dahmer entered the streaming true crime conversation most prominently with Netflix's 2022 series Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys in Milwaukee between 1978 and 1991, and committed acts that made his case uniquely disturbing even within the category of serial killers. He kept body parts. He attempted crude surgery on his victims. He engaged in cannibalism. He was arrested in 1991 when one of his intended victims escaped and flagged down a police car. He was murdered in prison in 1994. His case had been the subject of documentaries and films before, but the Netflix series, created by Ryan Murphy and starring Evan Peters, treated him as the central figure of a prestige drama, with the production values and narrative ambition of high-quality television fiction. The series was the second most watched English-language series in Netflix history at the time of its release, accumulating over 800 million viewing hours in its first month. It was also one of the most debated pieces of true crime content ever produced. The families of Dahmer's victims spoke out against it. Several said they had not been consulted and had learned of its existence when it appeared on the platform. They described the experience of watching dramatizations of their loved ones' deaths as re-traumatizing. One family member noted that the series had used her family's surname for a character without permission. These objections did not significantly affect the viewing numbers. The conversation that followed, about whether the ethical dimension of consuming this content had any bearing on the decision to consume it, about whether the family's objections imposed any obligations on the audience, was one that many people found genuinely difficult. Most people resolved it, in practice, by continuing to watch. The scale of the series' success, measured against the visibility of the objections that had been raised, suggested something uncomfortable about the relationship between ethical awareness and actual behavior in the true crime audience. The question of why we watch, what exactly is the appeal of content built around real violence and real death, has received increasing serious attention as the genre has grown too large to ignore. The most commonly cited explanation is that true crime satisfies a fundamental human drive towards safety through understanding. Crime represents a fundamental threat, and understanding how it happens, what circumstances produce it, what warning signs precede it, how perpetrators operate, is, from a deep evolutionary perspective, useful information. The person who understands how predators work is better positioned to avoid them than the person who has no such understanding. On this account, true crime is a form of threat preparedness education dressed up as entertainment. This explanation has genuine force, and it is supported by research. Studies of true crime consumption consistently find that women are its primary audience. They make up a significant majority of podcast listeners and documentary viewers. And this disparity maps onto the reality that women face higher rates of certain kinds of violent crime. The argument that women consume true crime as a form of self-protective vigilance has been made by researchers and by true crime consumers themselves, and it is not without basis. Many women who listen to true crime podcasts describe doing so as a way of learning to recognize danger, of developing a mental library of how bad situations develop, so they can identify early warning signs in their own lives. But this explanation is also incomplete in ways that become apparent when you examine it carefully. The specific content most popular in the true crime genre is not primarily focused on the kinds of crimes that statistically pose the greatest risk to women. Serial killers, who account for a tiny fraction of actual homicides, are dramatically overrepresented in true crime content. The crimes that kill the most women, intimate partner violence, which is both extremely common and overwhelmingly underrepresented in true crime entertainment, receive far less attention than the rarer but more spectacular crimes of strangers operating outside the domestic sphere. If threat preparedness were really the primary driver of true crime consumption, the genre would look quite different from how it actually looks. A second explanation focuses on the puzzle-solving dimension. True crime, particularly in its podcast and investigative documentary forms, offers the pleasures of a mystery, the gathering of clues, the weighing of evidence, the arrival at conclusions with the additional charge of those pleasures being real rather than fictional. The listener who works through evidence in a true crime podcast alongside the journalist presenting it is engaging in genuine analytical activity. The skills being exercised, logical inference, the evaluation of competing testimony, the assessment of alternative explanations, are real skills being applied to real situations. There's a satisfaction in this that the most well-crafted fictional mystery cannot quite replicate, because the stakes are real. This explanation accounts for some of the genre's appeal without fully explaining the breadth of it. Many true crime consumers are not primarily interested in solving mysteries. They continue consuming content about cases that are already solved, cases where the identity of the perpetrator is not in question. What they are interested in these cases, is something other than the puzzle. They are interested in the psychology and the biography and the social context, in the full human story of how this came to happen, what the perpetrator was thinking, what the victims' lives were like, what the community experienced, and what the whole terrible event means when you try to hold all of it in view simultaneously. A third explanation, perhaps the most uncomfortable, involves morbid curiosity, the simple human appetite for the extreme, for experiences that lie at the edges of what ordinary life contains. Death is the ultimate extreme experience, the one that all of us will eventually encounter but cannot fully prepare for. Violence is the mechanism by which death arrives most shockingly, most wrongly, most contrary to the expectations of both victims and the people who love them. True crime offers proximity to these extremes, a way of encountering them safely, from a distance, within the protective frame of narrative, with the knowledge that this is something that happened to someone else in another place and another time. This proximity to the extreme may produce a form of the experience that psychologists call mortality salience, a heightened awareness of death's reality that, paradoxically, tends to make people feel more alive. Studies have found that reminders of mortality, when processed in a psychologically safe context, can increase feelings of meaning and purpose, can prompt people to invest more deeply in their relationships and activities, can produce a kind of clarifying effect on what actually matters. True crime, on this reading, is a technology for accessing mortality salience in a controlled way, for feeling the weight of death without being destroyed by it. There is a fourth explanation that is less frequently articulated but may be the most culturally specific to this particular moment. We live in an era characterized by a profound and widespread sense that institutions are failing, that the systems designed to protect people and deliver justice are not working as they should, or are working in ways that benefit some people at the expense of others, or are actively corrupt in ways that have been deliberately concealed. True crime, at its best, is a genre that scrutinizes these institutions relentlessly. The most celebrated true crime content is content that finds the system wanting, that identifies failures and corruptions in the machinery of justice and brings them to public attention. There is genuine civic value in this. Democratic societies need citizens who are willing to scrutinize their institutions critically, who understand that the legal system produces wrongful outcomes, and that those outcomes are often the product of systematic failures that could be reformed. True crime, when it is practiced responsibly, provides a form of civic education. It shows people how investigations actually work, how prosecutions are built, what can go wrong, and why in ways that are emotionally engaging rather than abstractly informational. The people who listened to Serial and then read about the history of wrongful convictions, who watched Making a Murderer and then sought out information about the Innocence Project, were doing something genuinely valuable with the engagement that the genre had produced in them. The ethical questions raised by the true crime genre are serious and have received increasing attention as the genre has grown. They cluster around several concerns: the treatment of victims and their families, the potential for content to damage the reputations of people who may be innocent, and the broader question of whether the industrialization of real human suffering into entertainment content can be done responsibly. And if so, what responsibility actually requires. The treatment of victims is perhaps the most urgent concern, and it is the one that the families of victims have raised most consistently and most publicly over the years. True crime content is built on the deaths or suffering of real people, and those people have families and communities who continue to live with the consequences of what happened long after the true crime industry has moved on to the next case. The experience of having a loved one become the subject of true crime entertainment, having the worst moments of that person's life dramatized, analyzed, discussed, and consumed as content by millions of strangers, is, by all accounts of people who have gone through it, deeply damaging. It extends the trauma. It makes private grief into public spectacle. It often does so without asking permission, without offering any meaningful input into how the story is told, and without providing any compensation for the commercial value that the victim's death generates. This concern is particularly acute in cases involving the most notorious perpetrators, where the perpetrator's psychology and biography tend to dominate the narrative at the expense of the victims. The names of serial killers are known to millions of people who cannot name a single one of their victims. This asymmetry reflects something about how the stories are told and what the audience is primarily consuming. The perpetrator provides the puzzle, the psychological mystery of how a person becomes capable of this. The victims provide the stakes, the evidence of what the perpetrator's capability cost in human terms. But in practice, the puzzle tends to be more narratively interesting than the stakes, and the victims tend to become supporting characters in a story that is really about someone else. The question of wrongful conviction creates a different kind of ethical complexity. Some of the most celebrated true crime content has been built around the proposition that convicted individuals may be innocent, and this is a legitimate and important journalistic function. The scrutiny of convictions that may have been produced by flawed investigations or unfair processes is valuable to any society that takes justice seriously. But it creates its own hazards. Content that argues for someone's innocence, and that reaches millions of people, shapes public opinion in ways that have real consequences for investigators, prosecutors, and witnesses, who are often characterized in unflattering terms. When the content turns out to be wrong, when the convicted person it has championed is subsequently determined to be guilty after all, the consequences fall on the victims all over again. And the true crime content that championed the perpetrator rarely updates its conclusions with the same prominence as the original argument. The commercialization of the genre has also raised questions about which cases receive attention and which do not. True crime content is made primarily by and for people from relatively privileged backgrounds, and it tends to focus on cases considered unusual or spectacular enough to sustain audience interest over multiple episodes. The crimes that devastate low-income communities and communities of color, which are both statistically more common and less represented in prestige true crime entertainment, tend not to receive the same treatment. The implicit hierarchy of which victims are considered interesting enough to become the subjects of podcasts and documentaries mirrors broader social hierarchies in uncomfortable ways, and the genre has been slow to examine this about itself. What does it mean, then, that true crime has become the dominant form of popular entertainment in the early 21st century? The scale of its consumption, the hundreds of millions of viewing hours, the billions of podcast downloads, is a cultural fact that demands interpretation. What is this enormous collective appetite telling us about this particular moment in history? One reading emphasizes the relationship between true crime consumption and the broader crisis of institutional trust that defines this era. In a period characterized by declining faith in the police, in the courts, in the media, in the various systems supposed to manage social life and deliver something approximating justice, true crime offers a narrative form in which these institutions are subjected to sustained critical scrutiny. The genre, at its best, is inherently adversarial to power. It assumes that official accounts need checking, that conclusions need questioning, that the system's treatment of particular cases needs examining against the standard of what justice actually requires, rather than what the system found convenient to deliver. A second reading focuses on true crime as a response to the specific anxiety of contemporary life. We live in one of the statistically safer periods in history for people in developed countries. Violent crime rates have declined dramatically since the early 1990s, and yet the subjective experience of safety, the felt sense of living in a world where violence is unlikely, has not kept pace with the statistical reality. The 24-hour news cycle and social media and algorithmic amplification have created an information environment in which violence is more present in daily awareness than it has perhaps ever been, regardless of actual rates. True crime fits neatly into this environment. It provides a constant supply of vivid, emotionally engaging material about the worst things that can happen to people, consumed by an audience that already has a heightened and not entirely rationally calibrated sense of risk. A third reading focuses on something distinctive about the form itself: the specific way true crime collapses the distinction between fiction and reality. We are sophisticated consumers of fictional violence, trained over decades to engage with it while maintaining an awareness of its fictional status. True crime removes that protection. The violence it depicts really happened. The people it describes really existed. The deaths were real deaths. The families grieving are still grieving. This collapse of the fictional-real distinction produces a specific kind of engagement that fiction cannot replicate. When we watch a detective drama and the killer is caught, we experience narrative satisfaction, the resolution of a story. When we follow a true crime investigation and the killer is identified, we experience something that feels more like justice, the resolution of a situation that had real stakes. The emotional register is higher, the investment deeper, the satisfaction or frustration at the outcome more intense, because the outcome actually matters in the world rather than only in a narrative. The true crime genre, at the moment we find ourselves in, is at an inflection point. It has grown large enough that the ethical questions it raises can no longer be dismissed as the concerns of people who are too sensitive to engage with difficult material. The families of victims are asking, with increasing visibility, whether the entertainment value their families' tragedies provide to millions of strangers is something that should simply be accepted as the cost of a popular genre, or whether the industry that profits from it has obligations that it has not yet taken seriously. These are not questions that will be resolved quickly or cleanly. The genre is too large, the commercial incentives too significant, the genuine value of the best work in it too real, to expect it to simply stop. What is more likely is a gradual evolution, more attention to victims in the storytelling, more consultation with families, more rigorous examination of what any given piece of content is actually serving and whether the way it serves it is defensible. The conversations happening now about these questions, in journalism, in academic research, in the public square, are conversations that matter and that will, over time, shape what the genre looks like and what it is capable of. What is certain is that the conversation about why we watch matters as much as the conversation about what we watch. The scale of true crime consumption means that what the genre does and how it does it has real consequences for real communities. The woman whose daughter appears in a Netflix documentary, the man whose brother became famous as a victim of a famous killer, the family whose worst day is someone else's Friday night entertainment. These are not abstractions. They are the people at the center of the stories that the rest of us find so compelling. And the least the genre can do, the minimum, is to remember this and to make content that tries to honor it. That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something to think about, not just about true crime, but about why we consume what we consume and what our consumption means. These are not easy questions and there are no comfortable answers. They are worth sitting with. If you made it this far, thank you. A like, a comment, a subscription. It all helps this channel reach more people. It is how these stories find the people who need them. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one. The history of true crime as a literary form actually extends much further back than Capote, though in cold blood codified and popularized something that had existed in cruder forms for centuries. Broadside ballads about famous murders were sold in the streets of early modern England. Pamphlets describing the crimes and confessions of executed criminals were among the most popular printed materials of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Newgate Calendar, a collection of criminal biographies first published in the 18th century, was one of the most widely read books in Britain for generations. These early forms served some of the same functions that contemporary true crime serves. They allowed ordinary people to encounter the extreme at a safe distance, to feel the thrill of transgression without its consequences, to examine the moral failures of others from the comfortable position of the observer. What changed with In Cold Blood, and what has continued to change as the genre evolved, is the seriousness with which the form has been treated, both by its practitioners and by its audience. The broadside ballads were morality tales, simple and schematic. Criminals were warned off their chosen path by the bad ends of those who had chosen it before them. The pamphlets were sensationalist, interested primarily in the horror of the crime, rather than in any deeper understanding of what produced it. Capote brought to true crime something that had not previously been applied to it, the full attention of a serious literary intelligence, the willingness to ask difficult questions without assuming comfortable answers, the patience to sit with ambiguity and complexity, rather than resolving them prematurely into something more easily digestible. This seriousness is what the best contemporary true crime inherits and attempts to maintain. When Sarah Koenig says, in Serial, that she genuinely doesn't know whether Adnan Syed killed Hae Min Lee, when she communicates this uncertainty not as a rhetorical device, but as her actual intellectual state after a year of serious investigation, she is doing something that the broadside ballad never attempted, and the Newgate calendar would not have recognized as a virtue. She is being honest about the limits of what any individual investigation can determine, about the gap between what the legal system establishes and what actually happened, about the complexity of knowing anything with certainty about events in the past. This commitment to epistemic honesty is one of the things that distinguishes serious true crime from its more exploitative versions. The podcast that presents a cold case with the confidence of an omniscient narrator who knows exactly what happened and is simply building toward a revelation for dramatic effect, is doing something fundamentally different from the journalist who genuinely does not know and who brings the audience along on the actual process of investigation. The latter is more honest and arguably more useful. It models what serious inquiry actually looks like, rather than performing the appearance of inquiry in the service of a conclusion already reached. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 by law professors Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, has used DNA evidence to exonerate more than 375 wrongfully convicted individuals in the United States since its founding. The work of the Innocence Project and similar organizations around the world has demonstrated beyond reasonable dispute that the American criminal justice system produces wrongful convictions at a rate that the system itself had long denied or minimized. Many of the people exonerated by the Innocence Project had spent decades in prison for crimes they did not commit. Several had been sentenced to death. The causes of their wrongful convictions, eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, junk science admitted as evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective defense counsel, were not isolated failures, but patterns that recurred across jurisdictions and decades. True crime, at its best, has been one of the mechanisms by which the scale of these failures has become visible to a general public that might not otherwise have engaged with the academic literature on wrongful conviction. The emotional engagement that the genre produces, the feeling of having witnessed an injustice, of being personally invested in the outcome, is precisely what motivates people to read further, to donate to organizations working on these issues, to pay attention to proposed criminal justice reforms that might otherwise seem abstract. The audience that Serial created was not merely an audience for a story. It was an audience that had been given, through the specific emotional register of the podcast, a reason to care about something that was genuinely important and had been genuinely neglected. The relationship between true crime and the news media is complex and has shifted significantly over the decades that the genre has grown. In the early years of true crime's literary phase, journalists and true crime writers operated in largely separate spheres. The journalist covered crime as news. The true crime writer revisited it as history or as literary material. Serial and Making a Murderer blurred this distinction substantially. Both pieces of content were journalistic in their methods and ambitions. They were reporting on cases that had been through the legal system, yes, but they were reporting with the explicit purpose of scrutinizing whether the legal outcomes had been just. They were journalism in the most important sense. They were asking whether the official account could withstand examination. The mainstream news media's relationship to these projects was initially cautious and then rapidly enthusiastic. When Serial generated its enormous audience, newspapers and television programs scrambled to cover it as a cultural phenomenon, which in turn generated more listeners. The reflexive relationship between true crime content and media coverage of that content is part of what has driven the genre's growth. The true crime podcast or documentary becomes news. The news coverage drives more consumption. The consumption makes the next piece of true crime content more viable commercially, and the cycle continues. This dynamic has been extraordinarily productive for the genre's commercial interests. Whether it has served the interests of accuracy and fairness is a more complicated question. One of the most significant debates in true crime ethics involves the treatment of what are sometimes called minority victims, the people whose cases do not receive the extensive media and true crime attention that more prominent cases generate. The phrase missing white woman syndrome, coined by journalist Gwen Ifill, describes the pattern by which cases involving white women, particularly young and conventionally attractive ones, receive disproportionate media coverage compared to cases involving women of color, men, or people from less privileged backgrounds. This pattern is observable in true crime content as clearly as it is in news coverage. The serial killers who are most thoroughly documented in true crime podcasts and documentaries were not necessarily those whose crimes were most numerous or most brutal. They were those whose crimes touched the demographics that the true crime audience and the true crime industry found most relatable. The families and advocates of victims who do not receive this attention have pointed out, with justification, that the genre's apparent social conscience, its willingness to scrutinize the criminal justice system, to advocate for people who may have been wrongly treated, does not extend equally to all communities. The wrongful convictions that Serial and Making a Murderer highlighted were cases that generated widespread sympathy in audiences that were predominantly white and middle class. Wrongful convictions in communities of color, which are at least as common and arguably more systematic, have generally not generated the same level of sustained true crime attention. This is a genuine failure of the genre, a gap between its stated values and its actual practice that has been noted and remains largely unaddressed. The academic study of true crime consumption is a relatively young field, but it has generated some findings that complicate the simpler accounts of why people engage with the genre. Research has found that true crime consumers, on average, score higher on measures of empathy than the general population, which might seem counterintuitive to people who assume the genre is consumed primarily by those who are indifferent to human suffering. The finding suggests that the engagement with true crime is, for many people, precisely an engagement with suffering, a way of feeling, at a safe distance, what it means to lose someone to violence, what it feels like to be the person at the center of a terrible case, what the experience of injustice is like from the inside. This capacity for imaginative empathy with strangers in terrible situations is not a pathology. It is, arguably, a virtue. Research has also found that women who consume true crime content tend to process it differently from men. Women report more often that they consume it because it helps them feel prepared, gives them information and mental frameworks for recognizing and avoiding dangerous situations. Men report more often that they consume it because it is interesting as a puzzle or as a window into unusual psychology. These different orientations toward the material produce different responses to specific content. Women tend to be more disturbed by content that focuses primarily on the perpetrator at the expense of the victim, while men tend to be more comfortable with perpetrator-focused content. The audience is not monolithic, and the genre's diversity of formats and approaches has, to some degree, developed in response to these different orientations. The future of true crime is probably not a retreat from the ethical questions that have been raised about it, but an evolution in how those questions are answered in practice. Some of the most interesting work being done in the genre at the moment comes from people who are directly affected by the cases they are covering. Family members of victims who have started podcasts about their loved ones' unsolved cases, survivors of violent crime who are reclaiming their own narratives, communities that have been the subjects of true crime attention who are now telling their own stories rather than waiting for someone else to tell them. This democratization of the genre, the expansion of who gets to be the storyteller rather than only the subject, may produce work that addresses some of the ethical failures of the more traditional forms. The specific horror of the serial killer as a cultural figure deserves some examination, because the serial killer occupies a position in the true crime imagination that is wildly disproportionate to his actual statistical significance. Serial killers, defined as perpetrators of 3 or more murders with a cooling-off period between them, account for a very small fraction of all homicides. The FBI estimates that at any given time there are between 25 and 50 active serial killers in the United States, operating in a country that experiences approximately 15,000 murders annually. The overwhelming majority of murders are committed not by strangers with elaborate psychological profiles, but by people known to the victim, often in domestic situations, often connected to alcohol or drugs, often expressions of impulse rather than planning. And yet the serial killer dominates the true crime imagination in a way that these statistics cannot explain. He appears on podcast after podcast, documentary after documentary, dramatization after dramatization. He has been studied, profiled, interviewed, analyzed, and debated to a degree that has no relationship to his actual frequency in the world. The appeal, such as it is, must be sought elsewhere. Part of it is the puzzle. The serial killer presents a genuine mystery of psychology, a question about how a human being arrives at the capacity and the willingness to do what he has done. Part of it is the otherness. The serial killer, in the dominant cultural representation, is someone who looks and functions like a normal person, but is operating according to entirely different internal rules, and this gap between appearance and reality is inherently fascinating and disturbing. Part of it is the fantasy of the extreme. The serial killer inhabits a moral universe entirely outside ordinary experience, and encountering that universe at a safe distance produces something like the experience of vertigo. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which developed the practice of criminal profiling in the 1970s and 1980s, contributed significantly to the cultural construction of the serial killer as a type, a recognizable figure with recognizable characteristics, whose behavior could be predicted, and whose identity could be narrowed through systematic analysis of the evidence left by his crimes. The work of agents like John Douglas and Robert Ressler, who conducted the first systematic interviews with convicted serial killers and developed the frameworks for understanding their behavior, was popularized through books and eventually through the Netflix series Mindhunter, which dramatized the development of these methods. The profiling unit became one of the most influential elements of true crime culture, lending the genre a vocabulary and a framework. Organized versus disorganized offenders, the distinction between mission-oriented and hedonistic killers, the analysis of crime scenes for what they reveal about the perpetrator's psychology that has been used in true crime content ever since. The streaming era has produced a form of true crime engagement that is qualitatively different from anything that preceded it. The true crime community. On Reddit, on Facebook, on dedicated websites, hundreds of thousands of people engage with true crime cases as collaborative investigators, pooling information, analyzing evidence, developing theories, arguing about interpretations. These communities have, in some cases, contributed meaningfully to the investigation of actual cold cases. They have also, in some cases, contributed to the harassment of innocent people who their theories identified as suspects. The line between citizen investigation and mob harassment is not always clearly drawn, and the true crime community has crossed it more than once, with consequences that were difficult to contain and impossible to fully remedy. The ethical obligations of the true crime audience are a genuinely difficult question, and one that is rarely addressed as directly as it deserves to be. The questions of how individual consumers of true crime content should navigate the ethical dimensions of the genre, whether they have obligations to the victims whose stories they are consuming, whether they should patronize some content and not others based on ethical criteria, whether the enjoyment of the genre imposes any responsibilities, are questions that most people engaging with true crime have not thought through carefully. This is not a criticism. These are genuinely hard questions, and the cultural infrastructure for thinking about them seriously is still being built. What might responsible true crime consumption look like? If we were to try to articulate it seriously, it would probably begin with an awareness of what you are consuming and where it comes from, a recognition that the material is built on real events involving real people, and that those people and their families have interests that are not simply equivalent to the narrative interests of the story being told. It would involve some attention to how the content treats victims, whether they are given full humanity or reduced to their role in the story, whether their names and faces are treated with dignity or deployed primarily for emotional effect. It would involve some skepticism about content that claims certainty it cannot actually possess, that presents contested facts as established ones, that identifies suspects without the kind of evidence that responsible journalism requires. It would probably also involve some humility about the limits of armchair investigation, the recognition that the community of amateur sleuths who gather online to solve cold cases are working with incomplete information, are subject to cognitive biases that professional investigators are trained to recognize and compensate for, and have a track record of identifying innocent people as suspects with consequences that have sometimes been devastating. The enthusiasm for participation that true crime generates is not in itself a problem. The channels through which it is expressed can be. None of this amounts to an argument that true crime is a genre that should not exist, or that the appetite for it is something to be ashamed of. The appetite is real and understandable, and, as we have seen, it is connected to things that are genuinely valuable: curiosity about human nature, concern for justice, the specific kind of attention that serious long-form storytelling can produce. What it amounts to is an argument that the genre, like any powerful form of communication, carries obligations that go beyond the provision of entertainment. That the best true crime, the work that earns the serious engagement it receives, is work that takes those obligations seriously, that holds the tension between the legitimate pleasures of the form and the very real costs of the material it works with, that manages to be compelling without being exploitative, and to tell difficult stories without losing sight of the humanity of the people at the center of them. That is a high standard. The genre does not always meet it, but the fact that it sometimes does, that Serial and In Cold Blood, and the best of what has followed them manage to be both gripping and genuinely serious, is sufficient evidence that the standard is achievable, and that the effort to achieve it is worth making. The genre will continue to evolve. It will be shaped by the conversations happening now about its obligations and its failures, by the voices of people who have been its subjects, rather than only its audience, by the journalists and filmmakers and podcasters who choose to work within it seriously, rather than simply profitably. It will be shaped by the audience itself, by the choices millions of individual listeners and viewers make about what they consume, and how much they are willing to think about what their consumption means. These are not dramatic choices. They are the quiet, ordinary choices that constitute culture, the aggregate of individual decisions that determine what gets made, and what gets rewarded, and what kind of work finds the audience it deserves. The true crime genre, for all its complexity and its ethical difficulties, has demonstrated that there is an enormous audience for serious, careful engagement with the hardest aspects of human experience. What the genre does with that demonstration, how it honors or betrays the trust that audience has placed in it, is the question that the next decade will begin to answer.